Good to know that that's still the classic text.
Yeah.
It's time, so we're going, right? It's done. Okay, test, 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 test. There's a lot of juice in here. Do you have the pad up there? Do you have the iPad up there? Just back off a little bit. I think that's a little much in here. We want to be echoing off. How's that sound to everyone in here? Good? Is that good? Okay. All right. Okay, good. So if you're good for live stream, we're ready. Are you ready up there? Okay. All right. How many? 12 people on? Okay, very good. All right. Okay, yep, it is a good number, isn't it? So I was saying the other day, gosh, I shouldn't be telling stories. We have too much stuff to do. But I noticed when I sent our clergy, we have a clergy meeting every month with the clergy in the congregation to just touch base with each other and make sure everybody knows everything that's going on. And I put the whole list together, and there's 12 of us. How did this happen? So, yeah, it's pretty cool. Hi, I'm Steve, if you don't know me. I'm the rector here at Grace St. Paul's, and I'm so happy you are here. We are doing Episcopal 101, and as I said in the write-up to Episcopal 101, it's neither, because we'll do way more than the Episcopal Church. We're going to do church tradition, what we came from, and give you all of that background. And I think folks that have taken this before will tell you it's a little beyond a 101 class. But there's no tests, so there you go, all right? So I didn't prepare for you guys to take notes. If people want to take notes, do you have something? And I'm not in a place where we can get you in a location to take notes. I don't even know where we have any paper. Some people have some paper. Okay, good. Bulletins, perfect. There you go. See, there's mine from the sermon today, so there you go. That's perfect. And look, we have 2 blank pages on the inside. Okay, very good. And there are at least pencils in the pews. Okay. And for everybody at home, you have to get your own paper. So there you go. All right. Okay, so let's start with where we're going. So today we're going to do church history up to the Reformation. We won't do the Reformation. We'll save that for next week, okay? The Protestant Reformation I'm talking about. And then next week we're going to do the whole Protestant Reformation, and I'll give you a hint. What you learned about Henry VIII in school is not exactly accurate. So, okay, so we'll talk about that next week. And then the following week, we're going to talk about the Book of Common Prayer, the thing that holds us together as a church. And we're going to talk generally about the liturgical tradition in the church, why liturgy is important to us, and why that's another central piece of what we do. And you're going to also get my personal take on liturgy in this, which is a little bit different than maybe the whole rest of the church, but I'm just preparing you. There will be some editorializing in there. And then the next week, we're going to do the sacramental tradition. And so we will talk about how we understand that in the church. And I'll just give you a hint and tell you we will go way beyond the sacraments themselves to try to talk about what sacramental tradition is all about, okay? And then the 5th week, we're going to do church polity. Polity is politics, how we organize ourselves, how we govern ourselves as a church, and what that looks like, because it's way different than most churches. So, and it's one of the reasons I'm Episcopalian, to be perfectly honest. And then the last week, we will compare denominations today, because it's way different than what it was even 10 years ago. So we'll compare denominations, and then we'll talk about where we go from here, okay? I don't want to take a lot of time with introductions, but I think we need to hear from everybody. So if you could just very quickly say your name and what brought you here today, that'd be good, okay? Good? Okay. Who am I safe to start with? Okay, look, you guys have name tags now. All right, very, very good. Go for it, John. Okay. Is this green microphone going to work, live streamers? Okay. So really, you started watching the live stream first, and you talked him into coming, huh? Okay.
We're from Montana and Snowbirds, and we love this church already. Here we go.
I'm Sally, and I'm from Maine, a snowbird also, and in here because of Ev.
Hey, can you tell us what tradition you grew up in, or if any?
Oh, I grew up in Methodist.
Methodist?
Belong to a church in Maine now that is both Baptist and, oh gosh, hasn't been that long.
American Baptist?
It's a American Baptist
Okay.
and congregational.
And congregational. That's good. That's a good combination.
Hi, I'm Debbie. I grew up Lutheran in the Lutheran tradition, and I started doing Episcopal 101 2 years ago and got through, I think, maybe the third lesson when COVID hit.
Right.
So I'm here to repeat and complete.
Hi, I'm Carl. We just moved here from Utah, but I'm from here originally. I actually went to this church 40 years ago when I was a student here at U of A.
I didn't know that.
So, yeah, nice to be back exactly 40 years ago today.
Wow.
I'm Dale Ann Peterson. I'm Carl's wife. And I grew up Catholic in Bountiful, Utah, where we thought there were only two religions. You were either Mormon or you were Catholic, especially
Absolutely.
if you had a big family. And
And I think that's pretty close to true. So,
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I remember the first time I met a Lutheran, it just blew my mind.
I bet. Wow.
But Carl brought me to my first Episcopal church. He brought me to the first Episcopal church that was my church home in Utah, and he brought me to this Episcopal church, and it is now my church home.
Wow. Thank you, Darren.
Do we go this way?
My name is Marilyn. I'm a cradle Catholic, and actually an active Catholic until pandemic hit. And I did go to this church pre-pandemic, I think once, for Creation Sunday.
Wow.
And was blown away. And I tend to be quite progressive and into environmental issues. And the pandemic, silver lining, we've been rethinking our lives and where we want to be. And that's why I'm here.
Great.
My name is Diane. I moved here from Wickenburg. I found this church serendipitously. Someone in my Tai Chi class told me you had a Taizé service. And I grew up Methodist, then Presbyterian, then UCC.
All right.
Hello, my name is Sojik, and I grew up Catholic, Roman Catholic, and I found Grace St. Paul's on a walk in the neighborhood, and they had a solstice service, and that called me to it because I've been walking in indigenous practices for about, away from Catholicism and all the judgment, so that's what brought me in, and I just haven't left for a couple years in 2019, in the solstice of 2019.
And Soja can't leave until we have a greater indigenous presence here. So
Yes, that's one of my goals, because I think that it would be a great marriage, and so many people have, indigenous people have, like myself, have had a history of repression and coupled with the great eternal one. And so to say Jesus comes by many names, as Father Steve is so often saying, and it's such a place of growth and healing, and that I would like that so much if we could do that, when we do that, because we are doing that.
And we do have a Navajo family that just started coming, so.
All right.
Yep.
Okay.
Valerie?
I'm Joyce, and I've attended this class many times, and every time I learn something new, and I especially enjoy hearing all of Steve's stories.
Hi, I'm Valerie. I grew up unchurched and was baptized here as an adult, actually, back in 2010. And I've been trying to complete this course for years now, being very active in my retirement, as so many of us are. And I'm just delighted to be here again and hoping to complete it this time.
Yay.
Hi, I'm Darlene. I'm a snowbird too from Connecticut, and I stumbled into this church. Not the pandemic. Not last year we couldn't come because of the pandemic, but the year before I was here. The year before that,
Okay.
and I was able to work in the food pantry. So I got to have a good experience coming here. And I always assumed when I first left and went home the first year that I would take this course online because you have it online, and I never did. And I saw it now, and I said I'm coming in person.
Great. What's your background?
I was, the first thing I think of is I went to an aspirature that was to become a Catholic sister, a school sister in Notre Dame.
Great.
When we had those. And so I've never fully been able to escape all of my Catholicism. And I find that there's a lot that connects with everything in Episcopal as well.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Leo. I am a cradle Episcopalian. My grandmother was actually Anglican, and so when she moved here from England, that's how we became Episcopalians. I was baptized at St. Philip's in the Hills and grew up there my entire life. We are recently branching out in our fellowship and seeing about other Episcopal churches and their liturgies. We are coming from more traditional liturgy.
Yep. Thank you, Leo.
And I'd like to introduce my wife, Erica.
Thank you.
I'm Erica, Leo's wife, and I was raised Lutheran, and when I met Leo, that's when I was introduced to the Episcopal Church, and I just fell in love with mostly the tradition, but the liturgy as well, and so that's why we're here, branching out to meet new people, and I think that's about it.
Thank you. Thanks, Erica.
Hi, I'm Rebecca, and I grew up going to church wherever the neighbors were going. Parents didn't take me. I became an Episcopalian as an adult in my 40s, and my husband and I have been coming here for about 9 years now, I guess.
And I'm Dave Coatsworth. I'm a cradle disciple of Christ, and we continue to participate both here and at Saguaro Christian Church, promoting ecumenism.
Hello, I'm Ginger Taylor, and I grew up congregational back in New Jersey. And my husband and I have spent a good portion of our adult lives at Episcopal boarding schools working there, so I'm familiar with some parts of the tradition.
He told
and
me
I live
about-
in Tucson.
You did run the gamut of Episcopal schools. Wow.
Yeah, it's good.
It's good, yeah.
Hi, I'm Mike Wall. I'm from Rochester, New York originally. Been here about 10 years. I was raised Catholic, but I've fallen away. I keep complaining about the Catholic Church all the time, and my wife got sick of it. And she kept saying, Mike, why don't you do something about it? So I figured, well, I could either write the Pope a lot of letters, or maybe check out what the Episcopalians are doing. They seem to be doing the right thing, you know. And because I was kind of down on the fact that the clergy couldn't marry in the Catholic Church, and they had no women's clergy. Gays were not allowed, or they were generally condemned.
Yep.
So I just had it with the Catholic Church. I'm out, so I'm here to learn about the Episcopals.
Thank you, Mike.
I'm Gabi. I was originally born in Germany. Was baptized in the Lutheran Church, baptized and confirmed in the Lutheran Church. When I was living in Wiesbaden, Germany, I became a member of an Anglican Episcopal church there, and appreciated that very much. Appreciated the openness and the ability to inquire, ask questions, and learn more about the church and such. And so we've been here, Jim and I have been here for about the last 3 years now at Grace St. Paul's.
Hi, my name is Jim, and I was born and baptized into the Episcopal Church. And Gabi and I took the Episcopal 101 a couple of years ago, but because of COVID, it got interrupted. So now we're back again for a refresher and continuation.
Thank you, Jim. Joy, will you speak out loud? No? It's Joy. Oh. Oh, Tess, did we skip you? Sorry about that.
Hi, my name's Teresa. I like to go by Tess. That's my nickname. I'm also a Tucson native, and I found out about Grace St. Paul through an internet search of progressive churches, and I first attended in July 2018.
Thank you, Tess. So I'll just introduce Joy quickly. Joy's a priest kid, right? So her dad was a minister and congregational background. And I will tell you, so yesterday I saw Doug Peacock. He was here doing signing books. If you don't know who Doug Peacock is, I don't have time to go into that right now, but I did a sermon about him and the Grizzly Bears a while back. Anyway, Doug said to me that Joy Williams is the best living American author that we have right now. And yeah. Joy's most recent book is doing very, very great. So we're glad she's here. Okay, so what you've just heard is very typical of an Episcopal church. Generally speaking, 75% of Episcopalians come from a different tradition, okay? In this church, that percentage is higher, and you just heard it. So there were 23 of you, and 3 people said they had an Episcopal church background, that they started, they were cradled. And that's pretty typical in the church. That's what we are. We come from many traditions to make this up. And that says a lot about who we are, and we'll be talking about that quite a bit, okay? All right, here we go. Ready? So today I got so much information, but please don't hesitate to interrupt me, okay? If something is just going by you, stop me, raise your hand, and ask a question, okay? We're going to have to do that this week. In successive sessions, we'll have more dialogue, but this one has so much information. I'm going to just keep going until you interrupt me, okay? All right, very good. All right, so ancient Christianity. So we have to start with Judaism, of course. And the Judaism that we're talking about in the first century is very Hellenistic. Christians were obviously Jews, and I do need to say that out loud because some people don't know that. So I just want to make sure that you all know that. And we probably stayed Jewish until around the year 100 CE, okay? So in the Gospel of John, you notice all the tension in there, with John using the phrase "the Jews" very pejoratively in many cases. And that's because there's all this tension in the synagogues about this new sect called Christianity that's growing within the Jewish tradition, and how that gets difficult. And it was around a little bit after 100 that split probably happened. Okay, so Roman society in the first century is very, very stratified. Where'd that S come from in there? So my early history professor at Church Divinity School of the Pacific loved drawing triangles, and I just want to use one of them because I think it's really, really helpful to see. So Roman society is in the first century, very stratified, very conservative, very vertical. There's a lot of concern for status within there. And of course, it's polytheistic. The more gods, the better. So Romans didn't really have any problem with Jews or Christians other than the fact they treated them like little children. But they didn't have any problem bringing another god into the pantheon of gods. Judaism was the issue, saying, no, you don't understand. There's only one God. So that's where the pressure started coming. So in that society, at the bottom would be rural workers. That would make up a big portion of the triangle. And then next would be artisans. This is probably more like this. And then would be knights. If I could spell it, would be good. And then would be an urban minority. And at the very top, at about 0.002%, 1/10 of 1%, would be that urban minority. And then the knights and the urban minority made up a total of 1/10 of 1%. So you see how stratified it was. And it was all about piety in the Roman tradition, and piety meant reverence for the past. Patriotism is that kind of thing. So that's the world that Judaism is trying to grow in. So at the same time, as I just mentioned, Jews are monotheistic. They believe in the Torah. They believe in covenant law. So that's where the pressure comes in this society, the monotheistic part, okay? So this is a time of sects in Judaism, S-E-C-T-S, and there are lots of them. The ones that you know about are the Pharisees and the Sadducees, because we hear about them in the Bible all the time. The Pharisees believed in the law, that the law was central. It was about belief they had a belief in resurrection. It was a very popular movement. The Sadducees were the temple aristocracy. Then there were a group called the Essenes, and that was the group that withdrew from society. It was an apocalyptic group. They lived in caves and that kind of thing. Then there were the Zealots. The what? Essenes, E-S-S-E-N-E-S, okay? Then there are the Zealots, and they were the political activists in the first century, the guerrillas that were involved in warfare to try to make things happen. And in the body of that, all of this within Judaism comes of this Christian sect. So that early sect was known as the New Little Cult. Christians see Romans as material-oriented and worried about this life only, and Romans see Christians basically as just weird. They just kind of tolerated them. There were not all of those things like you see in the movies where Christians were tortured. That did happen, and they were killed, but they happened in very short periods of time, for bursts of periods of time. So basically, Rome tolerated Christians like little children. So Christians were sporadically persecuted. The first one was probably around the year 95, and that is when martyrdom became an important thing in the church, right around the turn of the century. When people were being persecuted, martyrdom was seen as an ultimate goal within the church, okay? By that year 100, the Christian movement is very urban, and it's very inclusive, meaning it will take anybody in if you're willing to believe in what we believe in. Some people have pictured Christianity the other way around as a movement in the country. It was not. It was an urban movement, which really shocked some people. So it was inclusive, meaning they take everybody in, but it was exclusive by belief. You have to believe what we believe, and then you can be part of the club. So by the turn of the century, Christianity was in 40 to 50 cities. It was in small house churches. There were about 50,000 Christians in an empire of 60 million people, to give you some idea of the size of this new movement. But there was this amazing confidence in the group that they felt like we were living the moral life that Jesus taught us to live, and there was all kinds of movement around that. And we'll talk about how that growth just exploded as a result of that. Okay, within all of those groups, there was a lot of discussion about authority in the early Christian movement. At the beginning, the authority was very charismatic. We had people that were called apostles, prophets, teachers, deacons, and elders, which would become presbyters in the church. And then sometime after that, bishops. The first bishops that we know of in the church occur around the year 110. That's the first documented evidence that we had any bishops in the church. But basically, authority and leadership in the early church was charismatic, and it was spirit-given. It was not people leading from the top down. So the church is a very egalitarian organization in a world that is stratified, in this Roman stratified world. So it includes a lot of poor people, a lot of women, and people are electing their own leaders. So in the early church, those first bishops were all elected, okay? So there is this external pressure from a culture that isn't egalitarian or inclusive, and this internal pressure as disagreements broke out about who we were and what we believed. And because it was spirit-driven, people just believed, and it just went like that. So the first really heavyweight discussion in the church was around Gnosticism. I'm sure many of you have heard the term Gnosticism. Gnosticism means secret knowledge, and it's basically a philosophy to explain why life sucks. And it's very attractive to many Christians. It's world negating, that the world's a bad place. That's how we end up with those desert folks that head out into the wilderness. It separates the spiritual and the material realm, and it's very dualistic. Material stuff is bad, spiritual stuff is good. Now, let me say right now that Gnosticism is much more intricate than this, and it would take multiple classes for me to explain what Gnosticism is. But I'm trying to give you just an overall feel so you can understand the heresy and what was going on there. So Gnosticism is eventually rejected because the church says material stuff is good, hence my sermon on Ash Wednesday, and that God created the earth. That's what we read in Genesis, and it's all good, and that there is no secret knowledge, that we know what it is we're supposed to be doing and what we're supposed to believe. But through that movement, asceticism begins in the church, this idea of moving away from society and to protect yourself from all the bad material stuff in the world. So even though Gnosticism was tossed out, it remained through asceticism, and Gnosticism comes back all the time. We got plenty of Gnostics in the church right now, so it's always around. So if material stuff is bad and we should be pure, you get a lot of this coming up from a guy named Augustine of Hippo. And some of you know about Augustine, and we're going to talk about that in just a second. But before we do, the church had to figure out what to do when they had heresies like this. So the church started to begin their understanding that there has to be some sort of authority in the church by around the year 200. And this came down is when you have questions, you need to ask your bishop what the right answer is to those questions. And that is a major, major change from what was happening in the early church. They appointed an authority to say, this is who you need to believe, okay? Those discussions about what to believe got really, really heated in the early 200s. There was a group called the Adoptionists. And another group called the Docetics. And this is one of the major controversies in the early church. The Adoptionists believe that Jesus was a man infused with a divine spirit. Everybody's trying to figure out what to do with Jesus and what Jesus means and all of this. So they said Jesus is a man, but he had this divine spirit. And the Docetics said, no, Jesus was actually a divine being that was masked in flesh. He only seems to be human. And they said that Jesus didn't suffer because, of course, God doesn't suffer. That was the major controversy in the early church. The eventual winner of that discussion was Logos theology, enfleshed incarnation. And that becomes kind of the basis of what will eventually be the Nicene Creed. And Logos theology is a combination of Hebrew Bible theology and Greek theology. And that melds into this. A man named Origen was kind of the guy who wrote this early description of Logos theology, and he described it as the Logos, as Christ being the mediator between God and humans. And he was stuck with this material body. And then another guy named Justin said that Christ is the mediator between humanity and divinity, a step below God and a step above humans. That was the discussion in the late 2nd century into the early 3rd century, and it never really got settled, okay? And I'm not sure it's settled now. But so you see how we struggle with how to explain who Jesus is. Meanwhile, in North Africa, there's another persecution in the church, the Diocletian persecution, and people start recanting their faith so that they don't get killed. And the controversy around this becomes, as the persecution dies down, what is referred to as the rebaptism controversy. And authority really becomes the issue in the church. Are the bishops overstepping their authority? And a man named Cyprian says, no, that is the bishop's job to figure out what it is we're supposed to believe and what we're supposed to do. And that we decided in that controversy that rebaptism doesn't make any sense, that once you're baptized, you're always baptized. And that theology has stayed with us to this day. We don't rebaptize people. Our Utah folks here will tell you about when Carolyn Tanner Irish was elected to be Bishop of Utah, and Carolyn, of course, grew up in the LDS Church, and there was this major controversy in the church about whether she had to be baptized or not. Was that a valid baptism or not? Her coming out of the LDS tradition. And it became a real stink in some circles. We all thought that was kind of funny, actually, but going back to this controversy from the 3rd century, but it still hangs around a little bit. This is also the time when the words apostolic succession came into being. Apostolic succession is the idea that Peter had hands laid on him by Jesus, And then the apostles had hands laid on by Peter and Jesus. And the apostles, when they appointed leaders in the church, laid hands on them. And then those leaders laid hands on other people down to me. That we followed this same succession of people putting hands, and we still do that in the church today. You're not ordained until at least three other ordained people are there to bring you into the church, including a bishop. And bishops have to have three other bishops there to ordain them. That's called apostolic succession. The idea that we've all had this line down, that all of our ordained people have stayed in this line. That has become a big deal in ecumenical conversations today, and it was very difficult for some of us to come together when some people suggested that chain was broken in other traditions. So what do we do? How do we bring those folks in? So the apostolic succession now line is so in the Roman Catholic tradition, the Eastern Orthodox tradition, and the Anglican tradition. It's argued that line of succession was never broken, so apostolic succession is good. And everybody else, they broke from that. I personally think that's a lot of hogwash. I'll play my hand right now. I just think that's silly because, first of all, when Jesus laid hands on Peter, he wasn't making him a priest. What was he doing? So we didn't have priests in the church until like the year 80 or so. So I don't get that. But at that point, the bishop became the central authority figure in the church. And that is the beginning of the centralized church in our tradition, around the year 250. So we know that there were bishops in 110, but their authority does not become institutionalized until around the year 250. Cyprian starts using the language separating clergy and laity, and that's when all of that stuff started, when we started separating clergy and laity. Also, very interestingly, Cyprian calls the Bishop of Rome one bishop among equals, and that stayed part of the tradition for many, many years. And it was only much later that the idea of a pope came up. In those early days, the Bishop of Rome was just like every other bishop in the church. So I'm going to hand you out this little thing that you can read in your leisure. On one side, it has the development of Roman papal authority, and I'll have to get it to all of you who are online, so I will do that. And on the other side is a list of women in the early Christian church. If you just want to pass them out, that would be good. So you don't necessarily need to read that now, but what you will see on the papal side is how the idea of a pope developed over a very, very long period of time. And it took a good 600-700 years before anybody even used the word pope, okay? That developed over a long period. And on the other side, you'll see evidence of women in the early church. There was a book written a few years ago called When Women Were Priests. I'd love to believe that stuff, but the history behind it is not terribly strong. But that sheet does show you what women's roles were in the early church. You start with Paul, of course, and there are women running churches in all the groups that Paul's talking about. And that's what I hang my hat on, that in the early church, before all of this authority, women were running churches. They weren't called priests, they weren't called anything else, they were just like everybody else, but they had house churches and they were running them. And that's where I get our basis for where we are today, okay? All right. So, we get to the year 313, and there's this little event in history. And we hear this story about Constantine, the Emperor Constantine, on the battlefield. and he has some sort of experience on the battlefield, and he has what is referred to as a conversion when he sees this image of a cross in the sky, and they're losing the battle terribly. And after that cross appeared, suddenly the battle turned, and they started winning, and they ended up winning the battle, and everything changed. So, yes, sir. Were Christians using the cross prior to this? Thank you. Yes. The cross became a symbol in Christianity very early in the tradition. The first symbol that you see everywhere is the fish, and that was the first symbol that was recognizable in Christianity, but it wasn't very long after that before the cross became almost as important and then overtook the fish. So, the cross image would have been around for at least 150 years before that. So the question has always been, did Constantine have a real faith experience on the battlefield, and is that what changed him? I'll tell you that in my particular church history class, when we talked about this, we all had to write a paper on whether Constantine had a real conversion or not, and we were split exactly down the center, 50-50. To a person, we were split 50-50 on that question. So I have no answer for you there, and you have to make your own judgments. But what I can tell you is the church changed tremendously at that point because Constantine made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. So everything changed overnight. The church was this poor little group, this little tiny cult that was in the background, and suddenly they had power, they had prestige, they had buildings, they had everything, and they represented the Roman Empire. So everything changed. And it is impossible to discount how important that is in the history of the church. It's one of the major things. And I will let you make your own decisions about whether that's a good or bad thing. Valerie. Yep, I think that's a very good point, and it's probably not fair to say that one way or the other.
Father.
Oh, sorry, the question. Valerie's question was how much of these kinds of experiences could be metaphorical, and how much of that early Christian wording could be metaphorical, and what is that all about? And my answer was, I think that's probably a good way to look at this. And metaphor was often used in the early church to make lots of points. I'll give you a quick, I don't want to get too far off track here, but let's take the book of Revelation, for example, okay? Which is a great deal. That book is totally metaphor. Everything in the book represents something else. It's not what it says it is. And why did the church write that book? Because they wanted to attack the Roman Empire without saying what they were doing. So the whole book is metaphorical, and we can go through the whole thing step by step, and maybe we'll do that someday. So yes, I think that absolutely could be part of this whole picture, and that might be an easier way to look at what was going on with Constantine. Yes, ma'am. right? Right, absolutely. I think that's really, really important too. And that's where we get hung up in the church today, because there are people who have suddenly decided that they want to literally interpret stuff in the Bible that was always meant to be metaphor, or it wasn't written to be history, it was written to tell a story, and people get upset that the history in the Gospel of John is in a totally different order than it is in the Synoptic Gospels. That's because it's not history. That's not the point. That's a really good point. So, and we're going to be going there down the road here, okay? All right, so Constantine takes over. The church becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire. 325, the bishop says, okay, you guys are the official religion now. We got to do better than this little ramshackle thing that you're doing where people can believe whatever the heck they want to believe, and you have these little bishops who are saying something, but that's it. So he takes all the bishops and he locks them in a room in this town called Nicaea, and he says, you're not coming out of the room until you tell us what faith is, what we're supposed to believe, what we can't believe, what's real, what's not. And you all know the result of that is the Nicene Creed, okay? That's where the creed comes from. That's what it's all about. And the discussion around there was still around this Jesus question and how can Jesus be God if you really are a monotheistic religion? What do you do with this? And that became the big argument there. There was a guy named Arius who argued that once there was a time when the Son did not exist, that the Son is not begotten. If God is the only uncreated, then there can't be two unbegottens. And then there was another person named Athanasius who said that the Father and Son shared their nature. And at the beginning, Athanasius was persecuted for this belief. He was thrown in jail, and then it went the other way, and Arius ended up being in jail, and Athanasius won the day. The winner at the Council of Nicaea was the Greek word homoousios, and I hate to just say it in Greek, but there is no English word like this. The closest we can come to is of the same substance, that Jesus is of the same substance as God, and that's kind of what carried the day and took us to this point today. I want you to understand that that's where the Nicene Creed came from. It was written to try to solve that early problem in the church, and just think about that as we use it, okay? Yes, sir.
Philip Q.
Oh, my gosh, you guys, it's like I planted you out there.
Sorry.
That's perfect. Okay, let's go to the Philiqui right now.
Philiqui? Okay,
Yep,
Philiqui.
okay. So if you have your bulletins from today, so here at Grace St. Paul's, we often do different affirmations of faith at 10 o'clock so that we give you a wider range of this. And it's, I don't know how terribly helpful it is to remind you about what we were arguing about in the 4th century in the church. So we often do multiple affirmations of faith at 10 o'clock to help you connect with your faith. But at 7:45, we usually do the Nicene Creed, stick with that traditional approach. And you will see on page 10 in your bulletin of the Nicene Creed, in the last paragraph, we believe in the Holy Spirit, the Lord, the giver of life, who proceeds from the Father and the Son. Okay? This became one of the major arguments out of the Nicene Creed and into the conversations at Constantinople, and that argument centered around this. Does Christ proceed from just the Father, or proceed I'm sorry, does the Spirit proceed from just the Father or from the Father and the Son? In the Western Church, the answer was from the Father and the Son. In the Eastern Church, what is now the Orthodox Church, it was the Spirit proceeds just from the Father. And we don't have time to get into that theology today, but that, to this day, is one of the major differences between the Orthodox Church and the Western Christian Church. And some of you, if you're really paying attention, that go to the 745 service, might happen to notice that I do not say "and the Son" when we get to the creed, and that is not because I care one whit about whether the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son, but I feel much closer related to Orthodox theology than I do to Roman Catholic theology. And I'm going to explain why right now, okay? That was like a plant was out there. So let's start with Augustine of Hippo. Augustine is the Western voice at this point in the church. And in the Eastern Church, that voice is represented mostly by three folks, two Gregories and Basil, who come up with this idea of homoousios, that there is one ousia in three hypostasis, three modes of God in one nature. The Eastern folks won that argument at the Nicene Creed, and that stuck with us. But Augustine becomes the major voice in the Western theology at this point. And Augustine is the one who comes up with the idea of inherited original sin, that all of us are stained with this sin when we are born that came to us from actual literal people, Adam and Eve, back to the metaphor stuff. And because of the sin of Adam and Eve, we have this sin on our souls, and there's nothing we can do about that. Augustine also talks about double predestination, the fact that our destiny is all set and there's nothing we can do about that, okay? Pelagius is the other voice that is arguing with Augustine in the church. And Pelagius argues for free will. He says that humans can control their own destiny, okay? And that through free will, we can decide if we're saved or we're not saved, okay? Augustine won that argument, and that is another major theology in the church to this day. And that went two ways. So let's talk about the Western-Eastern part first, the inherited original sin. So, because we all have this sin on our souls that we can't get rid of, in the West, the idea of baptism comes up. Thank you, guys. See you next week. All right. The idea of baptism comes up as the way to settle this sin that we're carrying with us. So baptism becomes the sacrament to get that off of us and to put us in a position where we can be saved, okay? In the East, where original sin was understood very differently than the way Augustine understood it. Original sin was understood as the sin that we all make, that all of us screw up, that all of us are sinful. And the Eastern folks say, so look at the first four stories in the Bible: Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, Tower of Babel, flood story. They say they all tell the same story, and that is humans screw up. They do something really stupid, and they ask for forgiveness, and eventually God forgives them. And that is the story, they say, of human history. That is original sin, they say. It's not something on your soul that you have to get away from you to be okay. All right? So their understanding of baptism is way different than in the Roman Church, where and what became the Roman Catholic Church, where you had to be baptized to be saved. In the Episcopal Church, we are much closer to the Orthodox Church in this belief than we are to the Western Roman Church. And that's why baptism for us is a welcoming into the community. It's bringing you into the body of Christ, but it is not about saving your soul. That's not how we understand what baptism is. Now that comes after a long time in the church where people have believed that. And I still get calls in the middle of the night from somebody at the hospital saying, "Come baptize my baby because my baby might die." And I go and baptize their baby because this is no time to have a theological argument about this. But later, we try to talk to people about that and get them to that place. That is a major, major difference in understanding in our churches. So I really want you to get that part, okay? That's really, really important. And that's the biggie. So the other one is the predestination part, the double predestination. And Augustine won that battle, but almost all of us today are Pelagian in our belief that we are not predestined to some fate that we can't control. But that is Orthodox Christianity, and it has been for centuries and centuries and centuries. Okay? So, my church history professor made this lovely image so you can see the difference between Augustinian sin and Pelagian sin. And those of you at home will just have to get it to you. Here it is. Okay, thanks. Yep. So the point is, there is no difference. Okay, how am I doing here? Not terrible. All right, good? Okay. Okay, so we have this little event in history that happens after that, and that is in the year 430. What happened in the year 430? Anybody? Or around there? We have the collapse of something. Yeah. So that changes everything all over again in the church. Christianity represented Roman culture. So in this new world, it was left to Christianity to try to save what was left of the Roman Empire. And that's where you get all of the monastics and monks sitting in monasteries somewhere, copying books down. And that's the only reason that we have Bibles today, is because they copied all of those manuscripts down. But it wasn't just Bibles they saved, it was all kinds of literature. We wouldn't have any Roman literature today if it hadn't been for those guys doing that. But the church, again, changed tremendously during that time. Clergy and saints became a kind of stability in a splintered culture. And this is where the miracle stories start in the 6th and 7th century. And you get a lot of popular religion where people believe in things that individual humans have done. And that is where their holiness resides. Dead saints kind of become the central place of holiness in the Western church. In the East, it's a little bit different. The holy is everywhere and can break out at any time. And icons become kind of the central place of faith in the Eastern church. And ideally, icons are seen as entrances to the divine, windows to the divine. Some people have seen that other ways, and that created another major controversy in the church in 787. We have the iconoclastic controversy, where people tried to throw all the saints out and the icons, and eventually they lost that fight, okay? It's interesting that in the 6th century in the church, the purity of the clergy became very, very important, because clergy are now set apart from the rest of the culture. They're really the only people who are learned anymore in the world after the Roman Empire collapses. So it became very, very important to separate them. That's when clerical celibacy started in the church. Okay, it's not until the 6th century that happened. So that's kind of interesting. In 561, women seen as impure can't be deaconesses in the church anymore. And if there was any hint of ordination within women's rights, it all ended then, okay? Papal primacy continued growing and was gradually grew, and you'll see that on the sheet that I handed out. That really grew around 590 to 600 in that area is when the idea of Pope being a different person than the rest of the bishops really started developing. The word Pope wasn't even used until the year 390. Until the 11th century, the term Pope could be used for any bishop. The 11th century. So that developed very, very slowly over a long period of time. Okay? Gregory the Great, 600, really started to build the church back after it had fallen on all those hard times. Monastic spirituality became kind of the center of the church. He creates a lot of Christian institutions to replace the civic ones. And that monastic model becomes the ideal for what clergy should be. Education in Latin was very important. The West is Latin now in their liturgy. The service moves out of the vernacular in this time period, okay, 600-700. And the access to the Bible was only through educated clergy. The church is the culture, as I've said. Gregory has missions to England. Celtic spirituality becomes a major influence in all of Christianity. This understanding that God can be experienced through the natural world, through solitude, and through pilgrimages as journeys. Fasting, repentance, penitential stuff all starts growing during that time period as people try to figure out how to connect to God in new ways. Okay, so by the end of the 6th century, penance is really big in the church, and the church is really built around monasteries, much more so than the bishop or a diocese, and obviously that happens because of the collapse of the empire in the new world that everybody's living in, and that difference culminates, like I said, in 787 with the discussion on whether icons and saints should really happen. In the year 800, Charlemagne, when Charlemagne became the empire, he was crowned emperor by the Pope. And the Pope, at that point, the year 800, has as much power as any other leader in the world, but he needs an emperor to protect him in that situation. Territories are conquered, they're Christianized. Charlemagne builds the new church. He builds churches, establishes schools, invites scholars in, and the second Rome is built, as it's referred to. So the church becomes uniform again. It liturgically is the same. You go to church in Rome or London, and you get the exact same liturgy. That was the way it was in the church by the up to the 1960s. You could go to church anywhere, and it was the exact same liturgy. And that happened during the 9th century. So the Roman Church is now a European church. The church and the state, of course, are obviously one, and it's a very different world. So coronation of kings become modeled after Episcopal consecrations. Those coronations and consecrations look like the exact same thing, and I'm afraid to say that some of that has still with us today. If you watch a consecration of a bishop today, it feels very strangely like the consecration of an emperor, and I think that's something that needs to change. So we get into this new world in the 9th and 10th century where we have 3 orders of people. We have fighters, we have workers, and prayers. Everything is separated in the world into individual things that people do. There's this major separation between clergy and lay people. Monasticism is in full bloom. We have all the Benedictine monasteries that are coming about. In the 10th century, Cluny comes in, and monasteries are going up everywhere in Western Europe. In the 13th century, the friar movement begins, and we know that mostly today because of Francis of Assisi. But in that period, this is the beginning of doing religion for others. So you have people that pray for you, you have other jobs, and that's where we got into this total separation for clergy to do the praying for you, and you just sit there and just pay attention. So the masses become totally non-participatory. It's something that the priest does. So what happens? Where is this table? It's sitting against the back wall, and of course it's an altar, it's not a table, and the priest stands here with his back to you like this, and he gets to the point where nobody even knows what he's saying anymore. It's in Latin, nobody understands it, nobody knows what's going on. So it just keeps going like that. It gets to the point where the priest is whispering the Eucharistic prayer because nobody knows what he's saying. Everybody's praying their rosaries or whatever. And what happens, we get to the point of consecration in the Eucharistic prayer, and they ring a bell. And what happens? Everybody stops everything they're doing. This is the magic moment, the moment when the magic is happening, and everybody stops and just pays attention to that, and then they go back to whatever they were doing. This is when votive masses start. We have feast days and saint days and we pray for the dead. People are responding to the liturgy now as what they see, not what they hear. And of course, they can't understand it anyway, so it doesn't make any difference. And this is also when the debate starts on whether Eucharist is actually the body of Christ or something symbolic. In the 10th century, true Christians are now monks, and monks work for the intercession of the dead. Relics become a major form of exchange in the church and become a form of power in the church. Monks start stealing relics from each other so they can have the best relics in their place. This is also when we start using unleavened bread instead of real bread. In the early church, we're meeting in somebody's house. We're eating a meal that happens to include bread and fish. And we go all the way from that to using this unleavened bread because it becomes so holy that people can't even touch it. The bread actually becomes a relic and is treated as a relic. It's venerated, it's holy, and it's pure. And if you turn over your sheet that has on the opposite side of the Augustinian and Pelagian stuff, you see where that ended up. We ended up with these things called monstrances, which still exist in the church today, that are so holy. So that little hole there in the monstrance, that's to hold a host, and in a consecrated host. And this is so holy that the priest has to wear gloves to pick it up, and they pick up this monstrance with their gloves, and they walk around, and that becomes the feast of Christ the King, which became the most important feast day in the church, and everybody would just look at it because it was so holy that people said, I can't ingest this in my body. My body's going to blow up if I do that. So ocular communion becomes the most important thing in the church, and there we go. Okay. Let me not get too carried away there. At the Fourth Lateran Council in the year 1215, there was a law that you had to take communion once a year. And what do we know about that? That nobody was taking communion, or they wouldn't have made a law. So, and that's, as far as I know, correct me if I'm wrong, anybody who has more recent data, but I believe that is still on the books in the Roman Church. It's called the Easter obligation, that you must receive communion once a year. And that's where this comes from, the fact that people were so separated. This is also when clerical celibacy was enforced for the first time. Yep. Yep. In our relationship with the Jews? And Christianization of the Jews. Okay. Will you... Well, we need to save that, though, for next week. Will you remind me to talk about that? Because that's a really important question. And that starts with this anti-Semitism that in the gospel, that people interpret as anti-Semitism in the Gospel of John, from those early days when that church fight is starting. But will you bring that up next week so we can... Absolutely. That's where we're going now. Yep, that's where we're going now. So the church establishes its political position over the state. The church celebrates its power and prestige with all this Gothic architecture. That's where all this is coming from. A rood screen is added in the church between the priest and all of you, okay? So now the priest is whispering this Eucharistic prayer behind a magic screen with little holes in it that you're trying to see that there's something mysterious and going on behind there, and everything's changed. Okay, I'm not going to get into this yet, but we're going to have that conversation at some point too. The First Crusade is 1095, and that's a struggle between the Pope and temporal rulers. The Pope claimed that he was the spiritual and temporal authority, both of them, for everybody, and that's when all of this starts. The Pope becomes just as important as any other temporal person, and that's where some of the issues revolve around. There is also a revival of learning in Western Europe at this time. Clerical celibacy, as I said, has been going now for a couple hundred years. And because of clerical celibacy, the church becomes the largest landowner in Europe, because what happens, the priest dies, and all of their land goes to the church because they're not married and there's no family for it to go to. So all of that land comes to the church, and that is another reason the church gets so powerful and so big and feels like they can do whatever they want. That's when the Inquisitions start to investigate heresy. All of that is going on at this time, creating this triumphalism in the church, why we have all this power and what that's all about. And I would suggest that clerical celibacy was another major reason for that. And the church took over all of that land. On the other side, this is also the time of Thomas Aquinas, so scholasticism is returning to the church. This is also the time, this meaning the 13th century, where we solve the transubstantiation debate. Do you all know what I mean when I say transubstantiation? The idea that something chemical is happening in the bread and the wine that actually changes it into another substance. And the answer to that was, what we taste is bread, but the substance literally becomes the body of Christ. And that was the way all of that. This was also the codification of canons. We started classifying everything. It was the beginning of 7 sacraments. We talked about the Feast of Corpus Christi. The Mass has now people are at Mass gazing at that host through the rood screen, saying their own prayers. The Mass is seen almost entirely as a sacrificial act, and the whole idea of this being a meal that we're celebrating together is totally gone. There's virtually nothing left of that. The lashback to that comes from Francis of Assisi, who tries to return the church to poverty and tries to link us back with all of creation, which has been totally separated in all of this. Say it again? What year was that? So that would be like 1250, in that neighborhood. Yep. So that's the backlash to this new power of the church. This is also when the doctrine of purgatory starts. How am I doing here? So you all know about purgatory. Purgatory is this place that you go to be cleansed of all the sins that you have if you didn't do something really, really bad, so that you can eventually go to heaven. Okay? This is also when limbo starts, the idea, remember back to Augustine of Hippo, where if you didn't get baptized, you couldn't be saved. So people said, well, what about poor little babies? That doesn't make any sense. What are we going to do without them? So limbo was created to put this babies in some place that wasn't hell or wasn't heaven, but you couldn't actually be with God because you weren't baptized. That's all of this. Interestingly, in 1229, at the Synod of Toulouse, it was forbidden for any layperson to own a Bible. Okay, that's how separated we got from all of this. In the 14th century, I'm going to skip that. Okay, so we're into the major triumphalism of the church at this point. Church had come from this place so totally different from where it started. Popes were as powerful as secular leaders. So we've now gone all the way from being the oppressed people of the first century to being the oppressors through the Crusades and the Inquisition. By the 15th century, there was a lot of lay devotion and popular piety. Obviously, you can imagine that in this world where you didn't even have a Bible anymore and you were watching the priest through this magic screen. There were a lot of pilgrimages and shrines and private masses to save all of your dead relatives, and feasts and processions. We talked a little bit about the moment of consecration when the bells rang. The words that the priest says in Latin are hoc est corpus. Does that remind you of anything? Somebody say it. Hocus pocus. That's where we get the words hocus pocus. This is the magic moment when everything is happening in the church. Private devotions are all the rage. And then something happens to change things. And that is in the secular world. There's an invention that is about to change everything. Anybody have any idea? Yeah, exactly. The printing press. Yeah. But in the Western world, yes. So the printing press is going to change everything, because when the printing press happens, the first thing that we're going to print are Bibles, and then people start getting Bibles, and they open their Bible and read this and go, what in the world does this have to do with what's happening behind this magic screen? And how do we go from being this part of the church to this? This is also, I'll quickly mention the time of indulgences, when you paid the church money to pay for your dead relatives so that they could do masses for that person so that they could be saved and go to heaven. And indulgences are what build a lot of the Gothic cathedrals. And man, is the church pretty far, 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 far away from where it was when we started. And that brings us to a time when the church is desperately in need of some part of reform. And that is where we will start next week. Okay? Good? All right. Lay it on me. We've got 7 minutes for anything else. What year did I finish in? Oh, it was kind of squishy. I was up to the 15th century. Yep. Yeah, that's about right. Yeah, yep. Say again? Say again? The time period between the printing press and Francis. About 200 years? I'm not positive about that. That's pretty close. That's pretty close. Do we have any questions online? Okay. Yes. Yes, sir. Yep. Yep. Yep, really good question.
Can you repeat it?
Yep. So the question was, there's been this recent situation in the Roman Church in Phoenix where a priest baptized using the word we instead of I in baptism for years and years and years, and the whole controversy around whether that's a valid baptism or not. So yeah, that's part of the issue that we talked about today. I was so tempted to use we when we did the baptism 2 weeks ago, just because of this. What would happen? Nothing would have happened because this is God operating, not me. Who cares what the priest says? This is about God and the person being baptized and all of us being a part of that baptism. So, I mean, that's how I personally feel about this. And that's what this is all about. It's just crazy. Valerie? Right. Right. Absolutely, because this is all about the community. But it's God acting, and God, I would argue, is also community, which would suggest otherwise we wouldn't have a Trinitarian faith, and that's what this is all about. So I find the whole argument absurd, and it's just embarrassing. Okay, good point, and a good question. And that's what our book of you could argue that that's what our Book of Common Prayer is. That we've decided that as a group. We go to General Convention and we vote on what's going to be in that book. Our presiding bishop does not say to us, this is what you're going to believe and this is the way you have to pray. We decide that as a group all together. The authority is at a totally different place, and that's what we're going to talk about in week 4, is that polity. That's totally different. And the other part of that is, I would argue that there are no words in this church that we would have to say in that form for something to be valid. And we change those words in this church every single week. And that's part of the reason that we're doing that. It's not that these words have magical power. There is no magical power here. My hands aren't magic. Okay, just because I got ordained and people laid their hands on my head does not mean that my hands are any different than any of yours. And that is what it's all about in this church when so many people say the words of consecration together. This is my body, this is my blood. This is an act of the community. Nothing happens if you guys aren't here. I can't do this by myself. And that is what I think is the major heresy of the Middle Ages, that the priest had so much power that they could suggest that they could make communion happen with nobody being there. That makes absolutely no sense to us at all on any level. And that is a major part of what's going on here. Yep. Yep.
But you could be assisted by an Episcopal priest.
Yep.
And that would make it valid, but you couldn't assist the Episcopal priest. So this is a recent controversy.
Oh, it's still with us.
Can you summarize for the online folks?
Yep. So the question was around what could make a valid worship service in the Episcopal Church, and how recently we've had arguments about a non-Episcopal clergy person being involved in a service and whether that is valid or not. So, and all of this goes back to apostolic succession, which is what we started with here. We say, so if a church broke from that succession, which is everybody except the 3 churches I said, then that makes what they're doing invalid. Well, again, I'll play my hand here. I just think that's absolutely absurd because we didn't even have priests in the early church. What are we succeeding from? It doesn't make any sense to me. But that's where we get these kinds of arguments in the church that come up all the time. That's why they had the big argument about Bishop Carolyn's baptism. Well, how absurd. Now, we can sit here, and I can make a strong case for suggesting that an LDS baptism is not a Christian baptism because it's not done in the same form of Trinitarian fashion. But for heaven's sake, we're not doing this baptism. God's doing this. We're just the vehicle for this. So it just doesn't make any sense to me at all. And the other thing is that we talked about earlier with Augustine of Hippo and the whole controversy around original sin. That's the other major thing that separates us from folks. And so I think it's really important for you to understand the difference between that Western and Eastern thought there. And for me, understanding original sin in the Eastern way, as Basil and the Gregories did, understanding that original sin is what we all do, that we all screw up, makes total sense to me. The idea that because of some historical people doing something wrong, that we carry something with us today, I don't get that. But you need to understand that is Orthodox Christianity, and it still is. Not here, it's not, but it still is. So. Tess. Absolutely. Yep.
Repeat.
And right back to the history point that was brought up, and the metaphor point. Yep, absolutely. You could believe any of those things and be fine. Good. Valerie? Right. Yep. Exactly. Exactly. Yep, absolutely. We're going to have that whole literal conversation later, but just very quickly, there would be no understanding of what a literal interpretation of the text meant in the first 600 years of the church. That question wouldn't have made any sense. No one would have understood it. What do you mean? Because it was all the same. It was not about whether something actually happened or not. It was about what the lesson was teaching us. It's totally different. Jeff, did we have a question out there? No. We're good? Okay. All right. We are at time. I want to honor our time. Thank you all very, very, very much. And next week, same time, same channel, we will do part 2 of church history, okay? So we'll talk about the Protestant Reformation and the real story of Henry VIII and all of what happened in America, okay? Thank you all. Thanks for being here. It's a heck of a lot of stuff, but the main things I brought up, that's what I want you to remember, okay? The original sin stuff and all of that, okay? Oh, shoot, I forgot the book. Bring that back next week. Okay. Okay. Thank you, Jeff.